Yes? I feel like I'm rigged up to the Internet of Things with this stereotactic cage on top of my head. So if I start acting stranger than normal, then you'll know why. It's very nice to see so many old friends again. There was a time, sorry, I must not deviate too much from that camera, which apparently is streaming me. There was a time when I spent a lot of time speaking to meetings like this. Sadly, those days are mostly gone, and I do other things now. But when the opportunity does come my way, I'm very glad to take it. For those of you who don't know me, I work for TENET, and I'll say some things in today's presentations about what TENET does. I've got two presentations, one after the other. One is on the Rural Campus Connectivity Project. It's an informational exercise only. And the other is a more reflective kind of exercise around the nature of NRENS, where they came from and where they're likely to go to in the future. For one of these, I have a PowerPoint deck, and for one, I don't. I don't much like PowerPoint. No aspersions cast upon my excellent Microsoft colleagues who are here today. Power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely, they say. It does have its uses if you're presenting charts and graphs and tables and that sort of thing, so I have some reason to use it today. But the first session I'm going to do just with words alone, if you don't mind. I'm going to tell you about something called the Rural Campus Connectivity Project, specifically Phase 2 of the Rural Campus Connectivity Project, and why it is of interest to you. So to understand, and I'm going to use the abbreviation RCCP, Rural Campus Connectivity Project, and there's lots of abbreviations in this session. I'll try and explain them as I go along. If I don't, stick your hand up if you want something clarified. RCCP1 originated in 2010. Early in 2010, TENET is the Tertiary Education and Research Network of South Africa. And HESA, Higher Education South Africa, at that time the Association of University Vice Chancellors in South Africa. These two organizations jointly made a pitch to the Department of Education, as it was then, for some money to connect institutions to the SANREN network. Now, why were they asking for money to connect institutions when SANREN was connecting institutions anyway? The reason is because at that stage, the SANREN project was primarily focused upon connecting research-intensive institutions. It was, after all, a project of the Department of Science and Technology. The interest of the Department of Science and Technology is, of course, in research, so they were mostly interested at that point in connecting research-intensive institutions, which mostly meant metropolitan institutions. So it wasn't easy for a rural institution to get the benefit of being connected to the SANREN network, but that connectivity was also critically important to every university in South Africa. We already had a big digital divide between the rural and the urban, and it was growing worse because urban institutions were getting connected to SANREN at high speed, and rural institutions were still running on low capacity, high expense circuits leased from providers like Telkom and Neotel. So the problem was an urgent one. So these two organizations made a pitch to DOE. In November of 2010, DOE approved a grant of 28 million rand to connect institutions to the SANREN network, rural institutions. The original proposal was to connect 50 institutions, to build 15 access networks onto the SANREN network and connect 50 institutions. DOE wasn't prescriptive about which institutions should be connected. They simply said rural institutions. And on that basis, a project was launched to go ahead and connect as many as possible. It was managed by a steering committee, which included TENET and the SANREN team, as well as Department of Education officials, AS Audit, and HESA as well. And it ran for a 4-year period, and in that time it connected 20 institutions, 20 campuses out of the original target of 50. The original request was for over 120 million rand. What emerged was 28 million rather than 120 million. But nevertheless, it was possible to connect 20 institutions at speeds varying from 50 megabits a second to a gigabit per second. Now, during those 4 years, the SANREN network underwent an enormous amount of evolution. Its backbone capacity improved very significantly. Its reach extended very significantly. But most importantly, the remit of the SANREN network evolved from connecting just research institutions to connecting all universities. And that change was quite important because it affected some aspects of the way this project worked out. The project was a success. Indeed, it was a transformative success for the beneficiary institutions. It became possible for them to do things they would never have been able to do before. But it was not an unmixed success. There were many problems with it. For example, it was never entirely clear what rural meant. What is a rural institution? What is an urban institution? Well, quite clearly, the University of Johannesburg is an urban institution, and the University of Venda is a rural institution. But in between those, there are entities that it is not clear. Are they rural or urban? That problem was solved pragmatically, simply by saying rural is anything that is off the urban edge. There were huge problems with site selection. How do we choose which sites we'll include and which we don't? Of course, the obvious way is to ask for lists from beneficiary institutions, and we had lots of lists. Boy, did we have lists. Some institutions submitted lists of 30, 40, 50 sites that they would like connected, and some submitted lists of only 1 or 2. That was quite problematic in its own right. But it became even more problematic because the list changed as time went by. Institutions withdrew sites from their list of proposed connectees because they were their strategic purposes were shifting. So a site that was important at the beginning of the project became less important as time went on. So the list changed a great deal, and that problem was aggravated by quite poor coordination with the SANREN group. The relations between TENET and the SANREN people were not good in those years. They were fraught with a huge amount of tension of various kinds, and that tension spilt into the management of this project in various kinds of ways. And it became very hard to rely upon some planning assumptions that were made at the early stage of the project about where the SANREN network would go and over what time frames. There were also huge problems with dealing with the operations and maintenance expenses on this project. Remember, if you procure a circuit on long-term lease, that's a capital expense, but you have a recurring monthly expense for operations and maintenance purposes, and the question of who was going to pay for that was never fully settled. Ideally, the beneficiary institutions should have been asked to pay for it, but it was not possible to ask them to do so because that would have introduced another inequity, because the SANREN people were paying for the operations and maintenance on their circuits. So that created a lot of tension that was never fully resolved. And finally, for many institutions, when the bandwidth finally arrived on their doorstep, they couldn't use it, either because their networks were antiquated. Very often the network would carry gigabit connectivity to an institution whose entire infrastructure was built around fast Ethernet, so the gigabit connectivity was wasted. Even when the switching infrastructure was capable, the things like firewalls and caches and proxies turned out to be huge stumbling blocks. And even when those weren't problems, there were all sorts of layers of policy which turned out to be very problematic. Charging for bandwidth sometimes was an obstacle. Many difficulties in the ability of beneficiary institutions actually to use the capacity. So this project came to an end in 2014, and as it was being wrapped up, TENET and HESA made a second pitch to the Department of Higher Education and Training, as it had now become, for a round 2 of RCCP. And the guiding principle for round 2 of this project was that it would aim to promote equitable access to technology. This was targeted as the main outcome of the project. And equitable access to technology is an important policy driver for the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is why this was an important project for them, or they quickly saw it as an important project to support. And RCCP2 was conceived of as a much more rounded intervention than the first one. The first project aimed at driving circuits to institutions. Take the bandwidth to the institution. What happens at that point is not the project's concern. And as I remarked earlier, it often turned out to be quite problematic. Simply getting the bandwidth to the institution was problematic because often they couldn't use it. So it was accepted that we needed to plan for some interventions at that level. So the project was not only about technology, it was about institution being able to operate the technology effectively. And operating the technology effectively meant not only low-level technical management, configuring switches and routers and caches and proxies and firewalls, but it also meant somewhat higher-level issues needed to be addressed as well, such as technology planning, technology lifecycle management, policy development, other IT competences which operated at a higher level than the purely technical, but which were nevertheless very important. And then finally, the ability to use the technology for institutional purposes was the other key issue which was targeted. So not only do we want the bandwidth, not only do we want an IT department that is capable of doing a good job of managing the bandwidth, but we also want an institution that can use the bandwidth for institutional purposes. Now, that meant two things. It meant e-learning in particular, being able to deploy and use effectively a learning management system, such as Moodle. And that's on the educational side of things. And on the research side of things, it meant some capacity or competence in e-research. The capacity to use data, to aggregate data, to process and evolve conclusions from data as an adjunct to the ordinary research program of that institution. So these are both important objectives which are going to be targeted in RCCP2. There is a very substantial sub-budget within RCCP2 for this purpose. So the DHET eventually awarded a grant of 71 million rand, subject to some modifications which are still under discussion, and about 10% of that budget was targeted for capacity development work of the kind that I've just described. So in addition to that, there are a number of key differences in the second version of RCCP2 from the first one. First of these is a commitment to driving optical fiber to main campuses. I'll say something about the use of wireless technologies in a moment in RCCP1. A key strategic objective for version 2 was optical fiber for main campuses, and a related objective was, wherever possible, redundant connections. The SANREN network, the core SANREN network, particularly its metropolitan reach, is built around redundancy. Lots and lots and lots of redundancy because almost everything is configured in ring topologies. As you get out of the core and towards the edge, so the redundancy levels fall off. You've got lots of spur builds, and the result, of course, is much lower levels of availability and reliability for such such beneficiary institutions. Correcting that was an important objective for RCCP2 wherever possible. Much more focus on the strategic selection of sites, making sure that the sites that are selected to be connected are in fact strategically important to the institutions that are responsible for them. Much better coordination with SANREN. I'm pleased to say that is really working quite nicely now. There's much tighter joint planning and collaboration between TENET and SANREN. And finally, as I say, significant human capacity development program as part of RCCP2. It is worth saying that the Department of Higher Education and Training itself is much more focused on mounting a strategic intervention in ICT in university campuses. They're doing a number of things already. They're going to be doing more in the future, as I understand it. And the RCCP2 program it should be seen as being positioned within a DHET commitment to much better management and support of ICT in higher education in South Africa. So that's RCCP2 in a nutshell. I'm happy to take questions at this point if there are any. It is universities. Now, when I say universities, that means public universities, because you cannot use the name university in South Africa unless you are one of the 26 designated public universities. There are private higher education institutions, but they can't call themselves universities. So yes, it's the universities in South Africa. The TVETs are not within the ambit of this project. Purely for universities. Well, that was in fact the very first point where this question of rural versus urban came up. The DOE, as it was then, clearly indicated that historically disadvantaged institutions should benefit substantially from this program. So did MUT count? Well, to my mind, it absolutely did count, because it was the one institution in the Durban region that was never connected to the SANREN optical fiber ring when that ring was deployed. And the reason why is because it would have been prohibitively expensive to drive optical fiber out through that industrial wasteland of southern Durban. It would have been probably doubled the cost of the whole ring. So they were just left out. They were left on an awful 4 megabit per second Telkom line. So we debated this issue at some length, and the simple fact of the matter is that the Umlazi is in fact quite rural if you go to it. And the consequence of that is because of the way the work of the apartheid planners was overlaid on ordinary urban geography in South Africa, meant that this was a typical outcome. And pieces of Pretoria, pieces of Johannesburg, all the major metropolitan areas have these segments which have been historically deprived very substantially by the consequences of apartheid, and often there's major institutions at work in them. So it was very quickly decided that yes, MUT was rural and it would be supported. It was sufficiently off the urban edge to warrant being supported by this program. Any other questions? It's a 4-year program. Yeah, also 4 years. Thank you. I actually prefer to use the keyboard. Thank you. Is there a laser pointer on this? Yes. Of course, Claudia. Yeah, the site list is subject to some modification because the list that was put to DHET included a whole bucket of sites in the Eastern Cape, selected around a specific intervention. But there's quite a lot of argument and debate about whether they should or should not be supported. So the site number is not specific at this point. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second thing that I'm going to talk about. I do actually have a deck of slides here, and I'm afraid I have a somewhat poncy title for this talk, which is Notes on Possible Trajectories. It's not a terribly helpful title. Many years ago, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith wrote a very nice little book called Money, and the subtitle is Where It Came From and Whence It Went. So maybe we should simply call this the evolution of NRENs, where they came from and whence they went. It's quite a high-level, reflective look at this thing that we call an NREN, and how it fits into our lives in the higher education sector. So the first question, of course, is, well, what do we mean by this thing that we call NREN? An NREN. We use this name all the time. National Research and Education Network is what the abbreviation stands for. But what does it mean in practice? It turns out when you start digging into this question that there's a huge number of ambiguities and obscurities. And the first of these is that an NREN may refer to either a network, bunch of fiber and optics and routers, or it may refer to the organization that is responsible for its deployment and operation. Both uses are common. This is how Dante described it. Dante is, apart from being a noted Italian poet, stands in this context for delivery of advanced networking to Europe. This is was the organization that ran the Pan-European Research and Education Network called GÉANT, which is French for giant, an enormous transnational network across 40 countries in Europe and surrounds. Dante doesn't exist anymore. It's been merged with another entity to form the GÉANT Association. But this was the way they defined an NREN. And it's defined on an operational basis. An NREN is the entity that's responsible for provision of data communications networks and services. So networks and services, those are two quite different things actually. And then there's a comment that the NREN network typically connects other networks at regional or metropolitan level. That's certainly true of the European context. Look at that phrase, NREN network. Well, that's a bit of an odd phrase, isn't it? Because if an NREN is a National Research and Education Network, then an NREN network is a National Research and Education Network, which is an odd construction. It simply points to the duality of the network being, or an NREN being either an organization or an actual network. Both usages are common. So maybe we forget about that problem and we simply define NRENs around these four basic things. This is what happens to make an NREN happen. You have to do four things. You have to design, you have to procure, you have to build, and you have to operate. And those four activities you can actually divide up in many different kinds of ways. In South Africa, two organizations jointly constitute, or jointly, sorry, the space gets complicated. Two organizations collaborate with one another, and their collaboration produces the South African National Research and Education Network in its totality. And they collaborate by dividing up these responsibilities for designing, procuring, building, and operating. And those two organizations, of course, are the SANREN group and the TENET group. And they're two very different kinds of entities. SANREN is a competency area within the Maraka Institute, within the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, functioning under the auspices of the Department of Science and Technology. TENET, by contrast, is a private company, it's a non-profit company owned by the universities and all the universities and 6 of the research councils in South Africa. And they've both been involved in this space for a long time, and they have pragmatically agreed to divide responsibilities between themselves in the following kind of ways. Now, you probably can't read this because this is a slide from my colleague Leon, from a slide deck from my colleague Leon Staphorst, who I'll say something about in a moment. And he likes these slides which have got lots of dense lettering in them. But it sets out a basic division of labor in which the SANREN group design and procure and do some of the building, and they do quite a lot of service development within that framework. TENET does quite a lot of the building, and it does the operation of the network, and it handles the operation of the services. And it's a functional division of labor which works well. The question that is always asked is, well, why don't you guys just merge and create one organization? That turns out to be much more complicated than it sounds. We have been working on this off and on to some degree for the last 5 years. And in fact, there's no straightforward and easy way for these two entities to merge with one another. And under those circumstances, we've simply agreed to go forward for the moment as we have in the past, but focusing on delivering the most effective possible solution for our beneficiary institutions. Merging at some point in the future would look something like this. This is a slide taken from a website called the Case for NRENS, which is it's an advocacy website of the Dante group as they were then. And the way this quadrant is set up is you've got 2 axes. You've got this vertical axis at the top of that is this is a funding axis. Where does the funding for the network come from? The top of this axis is mainly government funding, and the bottom of the axis is mainly member funding. And then the horizontal axis on the left-hand side is low levels of member engagement, and the right is high levels of member engagement. The SANREN people are entirely government funded. They derive no revenue at all from the beneficiary institutions. TENET, by contrast, is entirely member funded. We have no revenue from the state in any form. TENET is a very, very strongly member engaged entity. We are owned by and are accountable to 32 institutions, and the accountability is managed on an ongoing basis through a whole lot of structures which ensure that what we do is aligned with what our member institutions require of us. The SANREN group are accountable to the DST, not to the member institutions, but they are moving more and more strongly towards a higher level of membership engagement. If these two organizations eventually merge, then they will merge in this space here, something that is funded both by the beneficiaries and by the state, operates at a level of balance between them, and by extension at a level of balance between accountability to the state and accountability to the members, but at a very, very high level of membership engagement. So if this merger does eventually happen, it'll happen along those lines. I want to look at this problem of NRENs in a slightly different kind of a way, and that's to use the notion of capability maturity modeling as a way of thinking about NREN development. I wrote a short paper on this subject a few years ago, which it's been quite heavily used by a lot of people, and it's been developed further by a lot of people. What I wrote was quite crude and simple, but it seems to have inspired some people to develop this line of thinking in interesting kinds of ways. So let's talk quickly about what capability maturity modeling means. Those of you who work with things like COBIT and ITIL and ISO 20000 and all of these kind of frameworks. You'll all be familiar with CMM. CMM is simply a way of testing, to test for how capable, of course, in particular in the space of process capability. What level of process capability does an entity evidence? And typically one thinks of these levels as being layered one on top of the other, with the lowest level of maturity being designated 1, sometimes 0, and the highest level of maturity typically being designated at a 5. And this is an aspirational framework. One aims to grow one's capability by moving as much as possible to the next step in this kind of framework. So this, if I recall, is the COBA terminology: initial, repeatable, defined, managed, optimizing. I've seen this terminology used as well. Process maturity description, from chaotic to reactive to proactive to managed to optimized. You get better and better as you go up that scale. And sometimes you see this version, exactly the same as the one before, but it's got a 0, which is non-existent. So how are your processes? Well, if your processes are non-existent, then you're quite far down the scale of things. If your processes are, if you have processes but they're chaotic, you're doing a little bit better. And as you move up that ladder of maturity, you eventually get, hopefully, to this magical space where nobody ever actually gets, which is optimized process capability. So if you apply this line of thinking, or this set of layers, to the evolution of NRENs, then the lowest level, of course, is a level 0, no NREN, and importantly, no awareness of the need for one. Now, there are, if I recall, 192 countries in the world. I think the number changes on a daily basis. But take it as about 200 countries in the world. About half of them have functioning NRENs. And when I say functioning NRENs, I mean they function from pretty low level up to very sophisticated. That means about half of the countries of the world don't have NRENs. Now, in many cases, they have no awareness at all of the need for an NREN. They don't have an NREN and they're not aware of the need for an NREN. This is very, very common. There's all sorts of contexts where this is the case. And that is your lowest level of maturity. And I put it in simply because it's a way of dealing with cases where there's no consciousness of the importance of an NREN. There's plenty of countries where there's no NREN, but there's a real awareness of the importance of one. If you're in a country where there's no NREN and every university is connected piecemeal to whatever network is available to it, and you're dealing with visiting scholars from other countries, or you go to other countries and you encounter something like a real NREN, then you say, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could have that? So there's lots of cases where people are aware of the importance of this thing. And that takes you sometimes into a structured conversation around NREN development, which may or may not lead to something else. If it does lead to something else, most generally it leads to some kind of commitment, some kind of collaborative commitment to making something happen, which also doesn't always lead to consequences. The Ghanaians, for example, got to this point back in 2006, but it took them another 5 years to get to the point where they had a joint commitment to doing something together. And then things start happening from there. You get a level 4, which I call coherent service offering, followed by regional or better connectivity, and then finally to something much more elaborated and sophisticated. So, quick look back at South Africa. Where did we come from? Where did we go to? Well, who is this rather grumpy-looking old man? Anyone recognize him? No? No? It's Mike Lowry. Mike Lowry was the man who brought the internet to South Africa. He was IT director at Rhodes University for a very long time. He was the first person to run connectivity between institutions in South Africa, and that eventually grew into the UniNet network, which he ran for many years. It crashed for various reasons in the late 1990s, and this man, a lot of you probably know, this was the man who was the inspiration behind the network that took over from the UniNet network. This is Duncan Martin. He was my boss for many years. He was the man who built the TENET network into a functioning NREN-like network. And here's a whole crowd of people, lots of whom you know. That's Leon Staphorst on the left. He's currently in charge of the SANREN competency area. And this is quite a lot of his team on the right. Not all of them. This team has grown really large since he took over. This is Christian Kuhn. This is Colin Wright. And there's Simeon Matif, John Hayes, Zuki Makalima, Tabo Kweshe, Jeff Daniel. And there's a whole lot of others as well, about another 10 of them. People like Siju and Roderick Moy, Sandra, I believe, is here today, lots and lots of others. This is the team who built the SANREN network. They had some help from us, but through a remarkable achievement over about 8 years, they built an extraordinarily successful network. Here's the history of the network in 2 traffic graphs. This is from about 2004. Total inbound international bandwidth running at 22 megabits a second. And this is from right now. This is on one of the circuits that the NREN is using. This is it's one of the CCOM circuits. That's one of the WAC circuits. This is one of the 2 WAC circuits running at over 4 gigabits a second. About 18 gigabits a second flowing in internationally on this network. There's the same history in bandwidth levels, going from 241 megabits a second in 2008 to over 12,000 at the end of 2015. So my colleague Jeff Hoy has used the phrase bandwidth stockfell. I'm almost done, to describe how NRENs in Africa emerge. They emerge as buying clubs. They collaborate to buy bandwidth. And then as markets change and mature and regulatory environments are become more amenable to NREN development, so they turn into other kinds of things. For example, they might become research, education, innovation networks, or they might become advanced services platforms. Shared services platforms is another future. These last 2 I'm not going to talk about. They're very North American and European concepts. And in terms of service development, this is probably the interesting slide in this cluster. This is the kind of stuff that TENET and the SANREN people are focusing on at the moment. So the Federated Identity Management Project is a hugely important layer of where we go in the future, because it's an enabling platform for a huge amount of stuff that follows in the future, including some of these things. But these are the other typical things that are ongoing development focuses at the moment. So in a very rapid overview, that's the kind of space that we've traversed in the last 10, 15 years, and the kind of future that we're going into in the future. Any questions?
Great. Thank you very much, Duncan.
Thank you.
Just before everyone runs away, we have to take the group